Thank you, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along today. It's quite a good experience for me to present to a bunch of ag teachers. I was an ag student myself once at a high school in Queensland, and thoroughly enjoyed my time up there studying agriculture, as well as exhibiting cattle and sheep that our school had. So today's topic is going to be biosecurity. How do we talk about it? I decided to approach it as this. I decided to approach this method as the best way to engage with the conversation about how we talk about biosecurity and how we build biosecurity into day-to-day practices. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners, the land which we're meeting today. Through a meeting virtually, I'm meeting on Yorta country in Victoria, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So what is biosecurity? For those of you online, if you can just jump into the chat function, just put in a couple of your response to what you think biosecurity is. Biosecurity means a lot of things to different people. People think about borders, people think about states, people think about local communities. So it's good for me to understand what people think about what they mean by biosecurity and what they think I mean by biosecurity. But basically, what biosecurity means, it obviously bio from the Greek for life, and security from the Latin for secure or safe, meaning secure or safe. So they're the root words for biosecurity. Now, when we start talking about biosecurity in agriculture, in communities, we're often talking about something in particular. Often we're talking about biosecurity is the management of risks, the economy, the environment, the community, of pests, diseases entering, emerging, establishing, or spreading. Now that's the one in black is the common definition that is used both by the federal government as well as on farm biosecurity. Now, when I'm talking to producers, as well as local councils, producer groups, often we simplify it as reduce the risk of introduction of infectious diseases, invasive pests or weeds onto and within your community. Now, that's probably the definition that's going to respond and reflect better to your needs as ag teachers, as well as when you're talking to students. It's often, how do we manage biosecurity and what are the impacts of that? Would the impacts of that have on our community? So it's not just the farm, it's the community. And that's something that we often talk about is what are the impacts going to be? Now, biosecurity plans and biosecurity practices we do on our property in the community is one of a number of layers. Now, I like this slide, it's a good analogy. Basically, it's comparing it to a block of Swiss cheese. Now, basically what we're trying to do is every biosecurity practice we do is putting another slice in this block. And what we're trying to do is prevent the holes from lining up. And every time we add a slice, we add another step, another layer, another chance to catch something before it gets into our community. Now, it encompasses pretty much everything. It encompasses offshore activities. Often we talk about offshore activities the federal government conducts. So that's pre-inspection of goods prior to coming to Australia. It can be regulations on importing seed, animals, even semen and embryos into the country through such things as accredited agencies, accredited sites. It comes down to import conditions, where they're to go to, how they're to be stored until they can be checked. It encompasses passenger screening, foot mats and foot baths at airports, at cruise terminals. Then we start shifting into state government. So it's things like straw feeding bans, RAM bans, so restricted animal material bans. And then we start getting into on-farm biosecurity practices. And then they're also supported by traceability, livestock standstill if something does occur. So it's basically what we're trying to do is conduct as many practices as we can to reduce the risk of anything occurring into our community. Now, means of transmission. Now, the reason I've decided to talk about means of transmission is often something that people are a bit unsure about. How does a disease agent or a pest or a weed get into a community, into a farm, or into Australia? So basically, the means of transmission differ. Different means will influence different viruses, different pests, and different weeds. Now, basically, this pathway, it's more animal health focused, but similar things can be looked at, particularly when talking about plant diseases. Now, there's two main transmission pathways. So you've got direct contact and indirect contact. Now, direct contact are animal to animal and animal to human. Now, animal to animal, as it says there, diseases can be transmitted when an animal comes in contact with an infected animal. Now, there's things like pestivirus, as well as foot and mouth disease. Now, I've had some experience with pestivirus. I've worked with a number of studs in a previous role that had brought studs in a commercial operation that had brought pestivirus infected animals. And it took them a number of years to basically clear their herd out and get themselves recertified again. So pestivirus, if it gets established into a herd, it can really do a lot of damage. Now, animal to human. Now, these are diseases that can be passed from animal to humans. Now, these are zoonoses. Biggest one is Q fever. So that's why you get offered Q fever injections. I've been vaccinated for Q fever. It's highly recommended. We recommend a lot of our producers offer their staff Q fever vaccinations, as it's a safety thing. Leptospirosis is another animal to human transmission pathway. And it's something I've caught leptospirosis. It's not fun. I caught it during grade 12. It wasn't a good grade 12, I can tell you that now. Now, indirect contacts are slightly different. They can also be human to animal. So that could be things like viruses on the hands, often things like mastitis, cowpox can be transmitted that way. Fomites. Now, fomites are any object or material that can carry infection. Now, the picture there will probably come up a number of times in the slides. Basically, that's an idea of a fomite. Now, they're bacterial cultures. Now, that's just saying how clean and what cleanliness does to reduce the risk of fomite risk into a property or into the community. It's the same thing that gets done at the border, particularly if you've gone into New Zealand. They're even more prevalent over there. They really want to make sure and inspect your footwear. Just make sure you're not carrying any mud, any particles, any dirt. and they are clean. And if they're not clean, that you actually physically clean them there and then, or you dump them there and they get disposed of. Now, it's not just footwear, it can be clothing, it can be equipment, it can be hay. So the examples there are fire ants. Now, that's a very prevalent one, particularly in Queensland, with the fire ant zones, particularly moving fodder during different districts. Now, the other one that's come into play in Queensland recently is the guava root rot nematode. Now, that's a nematode that affects a number of crops, sweet potatoes in particular, tomatoes, a whole range of others, and has really come to the fore in the last 3 to 6 months. It's really stepped up. It's really gone outside its known zones and starting to pose a real risk. Now, last is vectors. Now, vectors we often talk about are predominantly insect-borne. Now, they're things like Japanese encephalitis. We've seen a number of outbreaks of that, particularly in the last year. Victoria had a big outbreak start of last year, where Agriculture Victoria was part of the response for that. We saw that come down. It'd never been seen before in Victoria, but with the flooding that had occurred in the East Coast in the prevailing years, the warm weather obviously increased transmission zones, mosquito zones, and we've seen that virus really take hold in this area. Now, the other one there is lumpy skin disease. Now, that's something that a number of the people that I know, particularly in Northern Australia, are quite wary of, and that's their big risk. So lumpy skin disease is another vector-borne disease spread by biting insects. It's currently in Indonesia and is spreading in Indonesia. So they're the transmission pathways. They're the common ones that most often occur into the community and onto farm. So how do we manage that? Now, when we talk about strategies, particularly when we're talking about communities and on farm, we can only do things that we can control. Now, your biosecurity measures and the biosecurity measures that we put in place day to day can only be effective in areas which you can have control on. So when we talk about farms and school properties, it's up to and including your border. So what measures can you put in place that can help you manage biosecurity day to day? Now, when we talk about communities, it's often what strategies can we do in a particular area to reduce the risk of infection? So often if it's in state forests or covenant zones, particularly for wildlife, it's about not bringing in equipment, other plants, weeds into those communities. How do we manage that? But basically, you can control what you can control and you can't what you can't. Now, often speaking to producers, they get really stressed about issues with borders, in particular state and federal control of biosecurity. They get really stressed. Now, it's often a similar instance that you can't control what a government does. You can control what you control. You can't control what the government does. You can't control what the federal government is going to do day to day. You can't control what the state government is going to do day to day. It's about what you can do now and what you can control to manage that. And that's the only way to look at it. And once you start looking at it that way, the mindset producers relaxes. They become less stressed because they know that it's taken that role out of their hands and back to the primary asset, which is the farm. Now, the strategies that we use often fall into 5 main areas. Now, these roughly align to biosecurity plans and fall into line with biosecurity templates that most of you will have seen. Now, they fall into animal inputs, feed and water, people, vehicles and equipment, production practices, and pests and weeds. Now, each of these have got strategies underpinning them. The reason we often talk about animal inputs, in most farms, your biggest risk will be importation of animals. Same thing as that occurs to a community. It's importation of animals or plants into that community that's going to be your biggest risk. Followed by feed and water, followed by people, vehicles and equipment. Now, the reason we talk about production practices and outgoing product is biosecurity is a two-way street. We can catch something coming onto our property. We can also transmit something off our property. So it's important to consider what biosecurity we can put in place for products leaving our farm or leaving our community. Now, last and least, it's pests and weeds. Now we've got a picture of a rabbit there. That's a common identifiable pest in pretty much every state and territory of Australia. Now, I've decided to do this a bit different. It's what questions we ask. Now, these are the questions that I often ask producers to think about when they're unsure about biosecurity. Now, as I'm running through these, I will give you some answers of the sort of questions that should be asked and the answers that are often considered to these questions. Now, first step is profit identification codes and National Livestock Identification Scheme. Now, they're first and foremost when we're talking about bringing an animal into a property. If I use Queensland, when I use Victoria as an example, if you have one or more livestock, that's horses, cattle, alpacas, sheep, goats, you have to have a property identification code. And particularly for cattle, sheep and goats, if you're going to have a property identification code and have one of those animals, you're going to have to be registered with the National Livestock Identification System, and they're going to have to be tagged, and you're going to have to do the transfers. The next thing is, are documents requested? Now, when I say are documents requested, that they're things like cattle health declarations, sheep health declarations, or any animal health declaration, as well as plant health declarations, particularly if you're bringing in plants from outside your zone or from interstate or from another country. They've got to be supplied. You've got to show evidence of that. Now, do new animals have the opportunity to pass diseases? And how do you manage this? Now, the reason it's framed like that is, what quarantine procedures do you have in place when you bring an animal onto your farm or into your community? Now, we talk about often it's 21 to 28 days quarantine when they're coming onto the farm. The reason we do that is it reduces the risk of those animals having something and transmitting it to your herd. By putting them in quarantine in a paddock or in a set of yards, you can manage that risk. Now, do sick animals on the farm have contact with healthy animals? Now, that's things like hospital pens or sick pens. Often it's a good idea, if an animal is a little bit sick, you exclude them, you put them in a set of yards or a paddock, somewhere that you can keep an eye on them and it's also in an area that's not close to other animals, that other animals aren't walking next to or walking along a fence line with. So you want to reduce nose-to-nose contact. Now, animals separated according to age. Now, often commercially, what happens is the young stock are separated from, particularly at weaning, or particularly when they're just being born, are separated from the rest of the herd. And the reason that's done is to reduce the risk of diseases being transferred from older stock to younger stock. Often we also feed them first or look after them first before we move to other animals. It reduces the risk of you acting as a fomite or a carrier and transmitting a disease that's currently in your older herd, who might be less susceptible to, who might have inbuilt immunity with, and passing it to your young stock, which don't. Now, feed and water. Is incoming feed inspected? Now, it can be as simple as requesting commodity vendor declarations. Now, these are a good example. When you're buying grain, when you're buying hay in particular, it gives what treatments have been applied to either the grain as it's been growing or the hay, the withholding period, if there's any withholding period on that. It also gives you a guarantee that the person who signed that is confident that there's nothing in that consignment. It's another underlying layer of assurance to make you more confident. Is feed and water protected from contamination? Now, that's often things like, are your silos well maintained, or are your feed stores secure, and do you bait or trap for any rodents? You want to reduce that risk. Now, is manure contaminating animals' feed and water? That reduces, obviously, that's a big risk. So it's things like, are your troughs high enough? Are your feed bunkers high enough to reduce the risk of manure entering them? Is your feed stored securely? Now, the next one, do young susceptible animals share pasture with older? Similar principle to the first slide. It's reducing the risk of transference from older stock to younger stock till they've had the vaccinations, till their immunity is up and secure enough to be able to withstand a threat. Now, people is another thing we talk about. Now, often we talk about dirty clothes and boots. Do they get cleaned, or do you supply footwear? Now, often people will focus on this and not focus on something else. So it's important to realize that there's no point doing these steps unless you've managed the animal inputs and have reduced the risk of a disease or a weed coming in through your animals. This is the next step. Now, are people carrying disease agents from their animals or plants at home to the community? So that's things like if you've got a vegetable patch at home, or you've got eggs, or you've got some chickens, and you've also got chickens at your place at work or at the school, you could be transmitting diseases backwards and forwards if you're dealing with them. That poses a risk. That's why often in particularly broiler and egg laying operations, as well as piggeries, they don't allow the workers to keep poultry or pigs at home. It helps them reduce the risk. Now, visitor logs, Visitor logs are a good idea, particularly for any contractors that might be coming onto the school farm or into the community. It can be simple as, the day, the date, so the date, what time, who they're coming to see, what they're doing, their name and their contact details. Basically, so if something does happen, you have a way, and the government has a way of contacting them to find out where they were and what they did during that time period. Now, are entry and exit points minimalized? Now, basically that means, do you have one entry and exit? So basically, when we talk about chaining any other gates that you have on the property and only having one entrance and exit. Now, it enables you to keep a closer eye on that entry and exit. It enables you to know when people are coming onto and off your farm. Now, are people carrying disease agents from sick species to healthy species while working on the farm? Basically, if you've got sick animals, you would visit them either last or first, and you'll change and clean down. Basically, you don't want to transmit anything that you've got, that those animals have got, with the healthy animals. It's a similar strategy that gets used when looking after young stock. It's the same principle. Now, vehicles and equipment. Now, same thing, entry and exit points minimized. Now, the pictures here, the picture on the right-hand side of the screen on the cardboard is capra beetle. It's capra beetle egg cases. Now, during 2021, there was a shipment came into Australia through packing cases for high chairs. And these are some pictures related to that. It was actually in the cardboard of the high chairs. And I was stood up for this response, and I helped in the operations, sort of tracking where the high chair movements occurred. So basically, something happened and we had to be able to trace that. So if this was, say, a vehicle entering a property, that could have been weeds or mud containing virus particles entering and being transmitted around your property or around the school. Now, are equipment and tools used on farms spreading disease agents? So basically, if you have to hire in or ask contractors to come in to produce hay, cut silage, cut grain or glean grain, are their equipment and tools safe? Have they been cleaned down? Have they been blown down before coming onto the property? Now, not everybody is comfortable with setting up cleaning procedures and clean down stations on farm. It's often about weighing the risk. If that only occurs, say, once a year, you have a contractor come in and cut hay or cut silage. Often a clean down station, if it doesn't get done before it enters the property, isn't often a practical. So how do you manage that? That is doing things like knowing where they went on the property, what tracks they used, what paddocks they accessed, and then monitoring that for a couple of weeks, a couple of months after they've been, to make sure that no new weeds pop up, and if they do pop up, that you can get on top of them quickly. Now, similar thing, if equipment is borrowed between farms or used between properties or between communities, it's the same thing. Can it be cleaned? If not, how do I manage that risk? Now, production practices. it's a good idea that we know when do things happen. Often we have set schedules. The bulls get joined at a certain time of year. We can monitor that. Milk gets collected at a certain time. We note that down, we write that down. How are things monitored? And do inspections change with the time of year? The reason we ask that question is it's an important consideration because often people change their practices depending on the season. So particularly if they're growing new product, particularly during the active growing stage or the active filling stage, particularly if you're growing grain, they inspect the crop more regularly. Same thing applies for animals, particularly during joining and calving or lambing. You inspect your stock more regularly, so those inspections increase. How do you manage waste? So basically what we talk about there is how is waste disposed of? Does it get buried on farm or does it get taken to the dump? If it gets taken to the dump, does it get put in a secure area till it gets dumped? So it's excluded from animals accessing it. That reduces the risk of animals ingesting something, ingesting plastic. Lead batteries is a common one that often occurs, particularly when lead batteries were often powering electric fence lines. If you've got old batteries lying around, make sure they're stored in a location away from any animal. It reduces the risk of a positive lead test occurring when the animals get sent to slaughter. Next thing is fences. Are they in good order, especially the boundary? Now, the reason that gets asked is often when I'm going to a property, I'd see a biosecurity sign on a gate, which is good, but the boundary fence will be falling over or the track is covered in manure and all the internal fences are in disrepair. The reason we like good fences create good neighbours, as the saying goes. Now, good fences prevent stock from straying, so it prevents your stock from straying. It also reduces the risk of straying stock entering your property. If you use exclusion fencing, it also reduces the risk of feral animals entering the property. Now, fence lines are good. You've got to make notice and take note of nose-to-nose contact, particularly if your school backs onto farmland or any other area. What contact does your stock have with other animals? Now, if your stock has contact with animals outside your control, so i.e. your neighbour's property or your neighbour's stock, you pose the risk of nose-to-nose contact. How do we manage that? There can be things like putting two lines of fences, running an electric fence and a set of droppers just off your main fence to reduce that nose-to-nose contact. Record keeping is a very good idea, particularly for those of you who sell livestock. It's a requirement by the LPA that you keep your records up to date. So that's things like animal treatments, inspections, pest inspections, animal health treatments, joining, everything like that. You want to keep as many records as possible, as well as livestock movements. If you're bringing animals onto and off the property, are the NLS transfers done timely within the time frame, so it's within 2 days? And are they notified? Now, pests and weeds. Are pests and ferals prevented from coming in contact with farm animals? Now, that can be things like, do you trap? Do you bait? How do you do that? And do you record that? Are pests controlled? Often they are. And are areas such as old dip sites, rubber sites, dead pits fenced off? So basically, the reason we fence them off and exclude contact with livestock is they pose a risk. Dead stock pose a risk of viruses, of botulism, particularly if animals are eating dead stock. I've had some experience working on properties that have had botulism outbreaks in their herds, particularly extensive properties. It's not a fun thing to deal with. Similar is old dip sites. Basically, old dip sites have a combination of mercury, arsenic, and various other chemicals that were used previously. You want to keep your animals away from that. Fire ants, particularly for those of you in Queensland in the southeast corner, are you in a fire ant zone? Do you manage that? Have you had your property inspected? Or if you've seen something that you're unsure of, have you notified Biosecurity Queensland for them to come out and have a look? Now, as I said before, it's about building simple steps. So the simplest step for animals is avoid buying in the disease. Know your source of livestock. Buy from a trusted, reputable dealer or a reputable agent and request a cattle or sheep health declaration. Now, the example on the screen is a National Cattle Health Declaration. What this means is it lists on there the treatments that have been applied to the animal. If it's cattle, what its yoni status is, particularly if you're buying from a stud, they're likely to have a yoni status. Where was the origin? If they've had a yoni's test, if there's been any other relevant information, and a declaration. Now, once they've been signed, these become a legal document. So they have to be kept for a number of years, depending on the state. And basically, when I was working with stud owners and commercial breeders, if they were buying an animal, or if I was buying an animal privately, I would also always request a cattle health declaration. Basically, my theory was if they wouldn't supply me a cattle health declaration, I did not buy that stock. Because if they could not assure me that the treatments listed on this were completed or were completed satisfactory enough, I didn't buy the stock. If they couldn't tell me what the yoni score was of their property, I didn't buy it. Basically, the reason was it increased my risk if I brought something that they would not supply me. So if they didn't supply me this, I didn't buy it. If they did, I had an assurance that yes, the best of their knowledge, the best of their ability, these animals have been treated with the aforementioned drugs or veterinary chemicals. Now, also with this, NVDs, and make sure that your movements are up to date. Next step, inspection. Inspect on arrival, induct and quarantine. Check the drench and vaccination status of new stock. Now, different people quarantine for different diseases. Some people will do it for 7 days, some people will do it for 21 days. The recommendation is often 21 or 21 days. Most templates talk about 21 days. You've got to remember that this applies to your own animals. So if your animals have come from a show, quarantine is often a good idea because you're often stored next to multiple animals from multiple locations with multiple animal health statuses and endemic diseases that might change depending on the location. So quarantine, even if it's just for 7 days, 7 or even 10 days, allows you to know what is likely to occur in your animals. It also gives the animals a time to readjust to the property and allows them to pass any weed seeds that might have been in their system, particularly if they've been in non-adjustment. Now, the next step is, as I said before, control the border. So maintain your fences. If you've got neighbours, planting tree lines is a good idea. Using electric fences, if you don't want to go through the expense of creating a fixed fence line, using electric fences to reduce nose-to-nose contact. Now, next step is restrict access to your animals. So restrict access to your yards, to your production areas, so your paddocks. So basically the only people that you allow on that should be farm workers, students that have been inducted onto the school farm, yourselves, or registered contractors or veterinarians. Take particular notice of any shared resources, particularly if you share transport or equipment, if you share tractors. Make sure you know where they've been. If they've been cleaned down, clean them down. If they don't been cleaned down, make sure you know where they go. Now, the next step is keep it clean. Recording visitor and vehicle movements is a good idea. Ensuring everybody arrives with clean footwear and clothing is a key thing, is a good thing. Now, it can be as simple as inspecting the footwear of your visitors. It could be creating a foot bath, or it could be supplying footwear to them. Now, gumboots and the most common sizes are good ideas to have on farm. I remember the school that I was at had gumboots in the shed that, particularly if we were working on down the farm, particularly if it's money we would use. It's a good idea. It's a good example of good biosecurity. Use a farm vehicle. Now, often that's not applicable to most school farms. It's basically the reason we ask that is it reduces the risk of the rep's vehicle or the Agri-tech's vehicle or the veterinarian's vehicle driving over your property or driving over the school to access the animal of concern. So that's why it's there. Now, foot baths. Foot baths are something I get asked about a lot. Now, often, unless you're going to manage a foot bath day to day, it's often not practical. It's not feasible because you've got to remember you've got to maintain the foot bath. You've got to make sure you've got cleaning agent there, that your cleaning agent is in date, that it doesn't degrade over time. Basically, if you have contamination with mud or feces in the water or on the boots or any of the equipment themselves, your boot wash or your equipment wash is going to be next to useless because basically the chemical needs to come in contact with the rubber or leather substrate itself to be effective. So a pre-wash is a very good idea. Now, often you need to ensure the concentration is correct. Some of these chemicals that we use in the foot baths, you require gloves to handle or to mix up on, even gloves to use when you're actually cleaning down the equipment because it will actually affect your hands and skin. You need to refresh the foot baths and the lifespan of the chemical and keep that up to date. So often these things aren't entirely practical for a school farm or in an ag farm environment. So how do we manage that? Supplying footwear, asking students, visitors to come and clean footwear or have a pair of footwear that they leave at school that only gets used on the school farm, particularly if they're coming from other farms or other properties. It reduces the risk of infection being transmitted from one farm to the other. So from the home farm to the school farm and vice versa. Now, if you do want to go down the foot bath route, there is a whole resource on the AusVet Plan Decontamination Manual. It's really in depth about how to manage a footbath. So if you want to do that, you can. Now, this is a setup of somebody I know locally. The reason I like to include this footbath, this photo, is for those of you who do want to do a footbath or want to do a footbath on your home farm. This is an example of how you can do it. So it doesn't need to be concreted in. Often my commercial producers will talk about, oh, I'm going to do a footbath, it's going to be concreted in, it's going to be plumbed. If you're a grazing operation, that's not feasible. It's not economically viable for you to do that. So this setup is entirely doable. Basically, all it is a couple of cut in half chemical drums. You've got hand wash. You've got the water hose with high pressure nozzle attached, so you can do a gross contamination clean before you go through the footbath. You've got hand wash there. You've got the visitor sign, so you can park when you see it by the shed itself. You've got a whisk and a scrubbing brush. So you've got a whisk there to mix up the chemical, and the scrubbing brush, this one's actually long handled, so you don't have to bend over as far. You've also got hand wash there to wash your hands down. So that's a low and cost-effective way to do a footbath if you're interested. Now, where to get more information? Your state agricultural department is a great resource. Often you can ask inspectors or your officers to come out and talk to you about biosecurity or about animal health. That's a good idea to do. Agriculture Victoria have also created a series of training modules and training courses on everything from foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease to come clean, go clean. So things about boot washing. Also grain biosecurity, there's modules on that site as well. If you want to talk about biosecurity to your students, Prime Zone have got a number of courses and learning materials available, as well as Farm Biosecurity. Farm Biosecurity is the catch-all. It's got all the production manuals. It's got record keeping materials. It's got templates. It's got everything you might need to give to your students. You can pull resources if you want some more ideas from them. It's a great and practical resource. Now, the summary. Basically, a good biosecurity plan is practical, feasible, sustainable, and designed for the farm. You don't want to do anything that you can't do day to day. So often in school farms, you've got to take a step back and have a look and go, what can I do? What can the farm do day to day that's actually practical, that's going to work with a number of different students? So often mass boot washing isn't going to work. So making sure they've got clean footwear to begin the day with is a good idea. They should include measures to reduce the risk of introducing diseases, pests and weeds into the community. So basically anything that you do on your farm should benefit the community as a whole. So you want to manage any pests that might have got onto your farm to prevent them getting off it. Make sure you relook and update your current plan if you've got a biosecurity plan, particularly if you're LPA accredited, so Livestock Production Assurance. If you have their LPA logbooks and NVDs, you've got to have a biosecurity plan ready in place. So it's a good idea, if you're unsure, to have a look at it. Maintain your visitor log, keep tabs of who they've been, where they've been, and when they've been. Finally, make sure your property identification code and your NLS database are up to date. Basically, that's a standard requirement. For the National Livestock Identification Scheme, it's got to be within 2 days of them arriving on your property. Full stop. It doesn't matter where you are, it's 2 days. It's a good idea to update your property identification code, particularly if managers change, if the area you managers change. So if you sell area or you lease area, it's a good idea to update it then.